Jake and Officer Daniels never expected to cross paths that night, but when a cocky teen decided he could outsmart a seasoned cop, what started as a thrill quickly spiraled into a high-stakes chase that would teach one of them a lesson they'd never forget. It was a typical Friday evening in the quiet suburbs, the kind of place where streetlights glowed softly over neatly trimmed lawns, and the hum of distant traffic barely disturbed the calm. For most teenagers, it would have been a night to relax, scroll through social media, or hang out with friends. But for Jake, 16 and bursting with restless energy, the night felt suffocatingly dull. He had grown bored with the usual pranks, the harmless mischief that gave him a fleeting sense of thrill. Something inside him demanded more, something that would test his wits, his nerve, and, most importantly, his sense of invincibility. Jake had always prided himself on being clever, on staying a step ahead of adults who thought they had authority over him. He wasn't malicious, not really, but he loved challenges. He loved the rush of thinking he could bend the rules and escape unscathed. For weeks, Jake had been observing Officer Daniels, the local patrol cop who had been a fixture in the neighborhood for years. Daniels was methodical, patient, and respected by most residents. To Jake, however, he was not a figure of authority, he was a puzzle to be solved. Jake began noting details obsessively. He tracked which streets Daniels patrolled at specific times, how often he checked intersections, the route he usually took on evening rounds, and even the exact color of his patrol car. To an outsider, it might have seemed like paranoia, but to Jake, it was strategy. He felt a sense of superiority in believing he could outsmart someone whose job was to enforce the law. His friends teased him about being the next mastermind criminal, but Jake didn't care. The attention fueled his imagination. He envisioned himself maneuvering around the neighborhood, executing a perfect plan, and coming out unscathed, all while Daniels was none the wiser. In his mind, it wasn't about breaking rules for fun alone. It was about proving his intelligence, his daring, his ability to manipulate a situation to his advantage. He imagined the rush, the adrenaline coursing through him as he navigated streets he had memorized like the back of his hand, confident that every move he made would be calculated, precise, and flawless. Jake spent hours thinking through every possibility, imagining contingencies for when things might go wrong. He considered disguises, alternate routes, even ways to mask the sound of a car engine. Every detail mattered, and in his mind, the plan was nearly perfect. The thrill of anticipation consumed him. Sleep became optional, excitement became obsession. He walked the streets at night, pretending to be casual while mentally rehearsing his route, timing every step, every turn, every pause. The town that seemed mundane to others transformed into a chessboard, and Jake fancied himself the master strategist. By the time the weekend arrived, Jake felt ready. His confidence was electric, bordering on arrogance. He didn't see Daniels as a police officer. He saw him as an obstacle, a challenge to his ingenuity. Every instinct screamed that this was his moment, the opportunity to prove he could outthink someone trained to anticipate every human mistake. And in that quiet, unsuspecting suburb, under the dim glow of street lights, the stage was set. Jake was poised to step into the thrill of his self-created game, believing completely in his own brilliance, unaware of just how quickly overconfidence can turn into peril. Jake's plan was deceptively simple, and that simplicity was what made him feel confident. He intended to take his father's car for a short joyride through the neighborhood, moving carefully enough to avoid drawing attention, yet boldly enough to feel the thrill he craved. Every detail had been considered. He chose a time when the streets were quiet, just after most families had settled in for the night. He memorized the exact route, noting which turns would keep him out of sight, which streets were poorly lit, and where he might encounter traffic. He convinced himself that every step had been accounted for, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a rush of anticipation that made his heart pound. Before leaving, he took deliberate precautions. He slipped on gloves to hide fingerprints and ensured that the car keys were easily accessible without attracting suspicion. He even thought about masking the sound of the car engine with music, imagining that any curious neighbor would only hear the faint hum of a stereo instead of the unmistakable growl of the vehicle. In Jake's mind, the plan was airtight, an exercise in precision and cunning that would allow him to move undetected through the familiar streets. He pictured himself gliding past intersections, confident that Officer Daniels would remain oblivious to the small drama unfolding under his nose. As Jake started the car, the thrill of taking control over his own risky venture sent a shiver down his spine. Every turn of the wheel felt like a calculated victory. He drove cautiously at first, testing his own nerves, listening for sounds that might betray his presence. The neighborhood, so ordinary during the day, transformed into a labyrinth of opportunity at night. Shadows stretched across sidewalks, alleys offered temporary concealment, and the quiet was punctuated only by distant dogs barking or the occasional hum of another car passing in the distance. Jake felt powerful, untouchable, as though he had created a secret world where he alone held the rules. But while Jake's imagination painted a picture of invincibility, reality was more unforgiving. Officer Daniels had noticed the car moving through the neighborhood at an unusual hour, and his experience made him immediately suspicious. Daniels didn't react impulsively, he didn't give chase right away. Instead, he followed at a discreet distance, observing the movements, noting the stops, the turns, and the patterns that Jake had so carefully rehearsed. The officer's patience contrasted sharply with Jake's impulsive bravado, and this silent contest of wills had already begun. Jake, fully immersed in the thrill, didn't sense the subtle presence of the patrol car trailing him. He felt the adrenaline in his chest, the pulse in his veins, and the intoxicating sense that he was cleverer than anyone else on the streets. Every turn he made, every narrow alley he slipped through, seemed to reinforce the illusion of control. The world felt suspended, and for a moment, he believed he could outmaneuver not just Officer Daniels, but the very concept of authority itself. The night air felt electric, and the quiet streets offered a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and dangerous. In his mind, the perfect plan was unfolding flawlessly, and the thrill of anticipation for what might come next made every second feel like a high-stakes game he was destined to win. The moment Jake realized he had made a mistake came suddenly, in a flash of panic he hadn't anticipated. For most of the ride, he had felt invincible, convinced that his careful planning had put him several steps ahead of Officer Daniels. He had taken turns with precision, avoided the well-lit streets, and navigated narrow alleyways as if he were rehearsing a scene from a movie. But in his excitement, he had miscalculated a single stoplight, running a red at a busy intersection. At first, he thought no one had noticed. The thrill surged through him again, a mix of fear and exhilaration that made his hands shake slightly on the wheel. Then, just as he glanced in his rearview mirror, the piercing flash of red and blue lights cut through the night, reflecting across the pavement and bouncing off the sides of nearby houses. Jake's heart jumped into his throat. The siren's wail was sudden, sharp, and undeniable. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. Officer Daniels had been following him all along, unseen, patient, and calculating. The sense of control that Jake had clung to so fiercely evaporated in an instant. Every decision he had made, every turn he thought was clever, now seemed naive. He slammed his foot on the brakes instinctively, then yanked the wheel to make a sudden, sharp turn down a narrow street he thought would lose the officer. But Officer Daniels was experienced, anticipating even the most desperate maneuvers. The chase had begun. It was not a high-speed pursuit. It didn't need to be. Jake's desperation created its own pace, his erratic turns and sudden stops betraying the careful planning he had boasted about. He darted down streets he thought were empty, doubled back, and tried to use the familiar shadows of the neighborhood to hide. Every time he looked back, he expected to see the cop losing interest, giving up, but Daniels remained composed, always keeping just enough distance to prevent Jake from slipping away entirely. The teen's initial excitement shifted into rising panic, a tightness in his chest that made him realize he had underestimated the situation. Jake attempted to outthink the officer at every corner, but each move only tightened the net. He cut through driveways, slipped past fences, and maneuvered into alleyways, but the experienced officer anticipated his every action. The quiet thrill of the beginning had turned into a tense, nerve-wracking sequence where every second counted. Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. He had imagined himself outsmarting Daniels, laughing at the thrill of evading capture. Now, the reality of consequences, the tangible presence of authority closing in, made him question every choice that had seemed clever just moments before. As the minutes dragged on, the streets that had once felt like a playground became a maze of entrapment. Every turn he took seemed to lead him closer to capture rather than freedom. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial excitement now sharpened into fear. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that his overconfidence had blinded him to the experience and patience of the man pursuing him. The chase was no longer a game, it was a lesson unfolding with terrifying clarity. The thrill of imagining himself untouchable gave way to the stark realization that he was being methodically outmaneuvered, cornered by the consequences of his own reckless choices. Jake's confidence, which had carried him so far, began to crumble with each passing second. The streets he had memorized became confusing in the rush of panic, each turn and alley no longer a clever shortcut but a trap narrowing around him. His mind raced, trying to anticipate Officer Daniels' next move, but the officer's patience and experience made him unpredictable in the worst possible way. Every attempt Jake made to outsmart him seemed to play right into Daniels' hands, as if the officer could read his thoughts before he even acted on them. The teen's bravado, which had once made him feel untouchable, now felt like a heavy weight pressing down, threatening to crush him. In a desperate bid to regain control, Jake tried to double back through a familiar residential area, hoping to throw Daniels off his trail. He thought that if he could hide the car in a driveway, behind a fence, or in an alleyway, he could wait out the pursuit until the officer gave up. But his attempts at concealment only exposed his panic more clearly. Every sudden stop, every abrupt turn, and every hesitation drew attention rather than deflected it. Officer Daniels remained calm, keeping a steady distance, anticipating Jake's mistakes without needing to rush. The contrast between the teen's frantic energy and the officer's composed strategy highlighted just how outmatched he was. As Jake continued to weave through streets, the reality of his situation became undeniable. The adrenaline that had once thrilled him now made it difficult to think clearly, clouding his judgment and magnifying his fear. He realized he had underestimated the experience and skill of the man pursuing him. Every shortcut he tried to take, every maneuver he believed would grant him an advantage, was countered by Daniels' foresight. It became clear that the chase was no longer a game or a test of cleverness. It was a confrontation where the outcome was rapidly slipping out of his control. Eventually, the pursuit funneled Jake toward a dead-end street, a place he had ignored in his mental map of potential escape routes. The realization hit him with crushing force. There was no way forward, no clever detour left to exploit. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as the full weight of his mistakes settled in. The rush of overconfidence that had driven him to this point evaporated entirely, replaced by fear, regret, and a helpless awareness that he had been outsmarted at every turn. Officer Daniels approached steadily, leaving no room for miscalculation, no opportunity for a final clever escape. At that moment, Jake understood the lesson he had ignored for so long. Confidence without experience and preparation could only carry someone so far. The reality of authority, of patience, and of methodical strategy had caught up with him, and there was no room left for error. His previous sense of invincibility was gone, replaced by the sobering knowledge that recklessness, no matter how carefully imagined, could never outmatch skill and experience. The once thrilling game he had envisioned ended not with triumph but with the quiet inevitability of consequence. Jake sat in the car, frozen, as Officer Daniels approached slowly, lights reflecting off the pavement and casting long shadows across the quiet street. The realization of what had happened washed over him in a heavy, undeniable wave. His mind replayed every risky decision he had made, every corner he had taken thinking he was clever, every shortcut that had turned out to be a trap. The thrill of the chase, which had consumed him only moments before, had completely vanished. In its place was the raw, sobering weight of consequence. He had wanted excitement, a chance to prove his intelligence and cunning, and instead he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. When Daniels finally reached the car, there was no confrontation, no anger, just the professional calm of someone who had seen this kind of recklessness countless times before. Jake's hands were shaking as he unlatched the doors, his earlier bravado replaced by fear and regret. The arrest itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but the significance of what had occurred was anything but small. In that moment, Jake realized that what had begun as a game had quickly escalated into a life-altering lesson. He understood that authority was not something to be outsmarted on a whim, that experience and patience often outweighed youthful arrogance and impulsivity. The story of that night quickly spread through the community, a cautionary tale of a teenager's overconfidence and the consequences that followed. Jake's actions became the subject of hushed conversations among neighbors and whispered warnings among other teens. It was a tale of reckless ambition and a reminder that thrill-seeking without consideration for safety or legality could lead to serious outcomes. People in the town were reminded that even seemingly small acts of defiance against rules or authority could quickly spiral out of control, and Jake's story became an example of how fragile the illusion of invincibility can be. In the aftermath, Jake faced consequences both legal and personal. His parents were shocked, struggling to reconcile the confident, clever teen they thought they knew with the reckless decisions he had made. School officials, friends, and neighbors all reacted in their own ways, some with sympathy, some with disappointment. The lesson, however, was unmistakable. Recklessness, no matter how cleverly planned, comes with costs. For Jake, the experience left a permanent mark on his understanding of risk, authority, and his own limitations. He had learned, painfully, that overconfidence could be just as dangerous as any tangible threat. Looking back, the night became more than just an incident of teenage bravado, it became a turning point. Jake's cocky attempt to outsmart a trained officer ended not in triumph, but in a sobering confrontation with reality. The lesson was clear: cleverness without caution, confidence without experience, and risk without respect for consequences can lead to failure, embarrassment, or worse. What had begun as a thrilling challenge ended as a story of humility and reflection, a reminder that no matter how smart or daring someone thinks they are, experience, patience, and foresight often win in the end. The quiet streets of the neighborhood returned to normal, but the memory of that night and the lesson it carried remained etched in Jake's mind forever.